for what it's worth, Vishal, I mean, it's obviously I have a sufficient ego that I kind of enjoy the attention, but I do think to some degree it's unwarranted, or something like that. And I think it's interesting. It's actually an interesting example if you just keep pushing towards your North Star, and you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be Albert Einstein or something. But if you keep pushing towards your North Star, you don't show complete inflexibility, but at the same time, you don't give up on trying to take steps towards that North Star. Over time, you kind of, there are fewer and fewer of you around, and suddenly you realize that you're kind of the one who's walking, the only one, or a very small group of people who are walking towards that North Star. And I think that actually you don't have to be a genius, but the wisdom that you pick up along the way is actually interesting to other people. But that happens because you've been walking towards that North Star and you've been trying to figure it out. And you keep trying to figure out, and you keep trying to make progress. And you may spend, periods where you don't make any progress at all or even go backwards. But you still keep yearning in that direction. And then suddenly you wake up suddenly I wake up and some people think that I have wisdom, And so I guess I'm trying to express the idea of imposter syndrome a little bit. And, and then the realization that maybe I'm not such an imposter. Maybe the process of sort of pushing on this path has actually gotten me somewhere that I can be proud of, I guess, something like that.
Hi, it's Vishal here, and welcome back to the new episode of the 1% Show. In this episode, I speak to Guy Spier, who is the founder and investment manager at Aquamarine Capital, and author of The Education of a Value Investor, which is one of the best books I have read about someone's personal journey in life, business, and investing. Guy founded Aquamarine in 1997 with capital from family and friends, and its investment philosophy was inspired by the original 1950s partnerships of Warren Buffett. In fact, in 2007, he won a bid with Mohnish Pabrai, whom I had interviewed in the 4th episode of this show, for a charity lunch with Warren Buffett. We will touch upon a bit on that lunch and lessons from Buffett in this show. Guy has an MBA from the Harvard Business School and holds a first-class degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University. With this and no further delay, Guy, welcome to the 1% Show, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Vishal, it's kind of you to have me on your show, and thank you for reading that introduction. I kind of find it surprising to think that describes me. I think maybe you're describing somebody else. And as we said before, I think I have a certain amount of imposter syndrome, but there we go.
You have a lot of insights and wisdom to share, guys. So I'm sure by the end of this show and conversation, the readers, the listeners, the audience, and I'm going to realize how much more you have to share. So thank you so much for your time and everything.
Yeah, and just to let the listener in or the viewer in on the conversation that we're having before, what I realize is that you don't have to be the smartest guy in the room to develop any kind of wisdom. You get the wisdom by trying, by pushing, finding out what your North Star is, pushing in that direction, making mistakes, having setbacks, trying different ways to reach towards that North Star. And in the process of discovering what works and what doesn't work, I can look up and suddenly realize, actually, maybe I did develop some wisdom along the way. But the wisdom develops because you made a lot of mistakes and there were a lot of things that didn't work out. And so it's kind of like an intent and a desire combined with interactions with the practical world, I guess.
Wonderful. So you talked about the idea of North Star, Guy, and I think I had a different question in mind to start this conversation with, but I would start with the North Star, right? You've written about it in some ways in your book, right? Which is a beautiful book that one of the best books that I've ever read, right? And as I was mentioning to you before recording this conversation, that was one book which after I kept down after reading, I realized, oh God, this was my story. Except, of course, the Oxford and Harvard degrees and the investment banking job. But it was like me living my life through your words in your book. So thank you so much for writing that. Talking about your North Stars, right? So please help us with when did you exactly locate your North Star and you started walking towards that? What was the situation, and how has your evolution been over the years?
And I should just tell you that, seeing as you are in India, that if I stop and think about it, you cannot underestimate the influence that reading Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography had on me in writing this book. In a certain way, Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography was kind of there in my mind the whole time that I was writing it, as a kind of an example of what is possible in terms of writing memoirs or autobiographies. If we just go back to, and I just wanted to acknowledge that, especially, I realize that not all of the audience will be Indian, but at least some of the audience will be Indian. And so he's a hero for me too. At the time that I was a student at university, Milton Friedman had not been debunked as much as he has today. And the ideas of Milton Friedman come from a long line of, it goes back to Adam Smith and the idea of the invisible hand, and this idea that if people just pursue their self-interest, the market system will take care of the rest. And all of that got expressed in that famous Wall Street movie where Gordon Gekko says, for want of a better word, greed is good. And so I think that I felt like I had a moral justification for effectively being greedy. And so that I think that started off as my North Star. While at the same time, I think that I can see now an enormous amount of fear over what had happened just a couple of generations before to my father's family in Germany, where they had to leave in a hurry in spite of being very well established as lawyers and industrialists, because a new party came to power that decided that Jews weren't the flavor of the month. And so kind of like greed and a desire never to have to experience that kind of setback to one's family fortunes. And it's funny because everybody's aware of the history of the Jews in Germany and the Holocaust. And I'm reminded that something equally, if not more tragic, was the partition of India into India and Pakistan, where, I think that 20 million people were made refugees in that partition, and there were enormous amount of human misery caused. So it's not something that has only happened in Western Europe or in other parts of the world. It's something that I think Indians are very, very familiar with. And I think it's a very rational and good thing to ask oneself the question whether or not one in any way has one's history rooted, say, in the partition of India or in the Holocaust. How do I set up my life in such a way that those kinds of calamities are the very, very least likely to impact me? And so I think that those really were my North Stars. And of course, as you know from the book, seeking that out in a direct fashion got me tripped up pretty quick coming out of business school, because I'd kind of narrowly focused on this idea of making money, lots of it, as fast as possible. And it was only then that I kind of had to retool myself. And lucky for me, I discovered a new star, which was, I guess, a new North Star, which still had the same goals of financial security and financial success and financial security. But I discovered a far better way of going about finding them. And rather the Milton Friedman, Gordon Gekko, Adam Smith, just follow your self-interest in a very narrow way, I discovered a way of kind of being more generous towards the world and allowing the world to give back to me its kind of fruits when it was ready. And that really started off an extraordinary journey. And it's an extraordinary North Star to have, actually, just an extraordinary North Star. I think that, just talking to you right now, there's an element of it which is slightly religious, actually. It's very secular, but, there's some feelings I get around talking about this which are not dissimilar to the feelings I would get inside a church or a synagogue, I think.
The evolution we all know, right? How you've been, how you evolved over the years from where you started off, right? Straight out of college into an investment bank, and you started hating that job, and then decided to pursue value investing because you came across Warren Buffett and his lessons, and decided to start your own investment management firm. In your book, you've mentioned about your initial career struggles in the investment banking business, right? And one of the biggest reasons I find your book amazing is because it talks less about value investing and more on the way a value investor can develop his or her character over a period of time. In the introduction of the book, you've mentioned how this book is also about the inner game of investing, and by extension, the inner game of life. You write, and I quote, as I have come to discover, investing is much more about money. So as your wealth grows, I hope you will also come to realize that the money is largely irrelevant. And what you will want to do with the bulk of your wealth is give it back to society. I would want you to elaborate on this thought.
Just to stay with the idea of the inner game, I don't play very well golf, and I don't play much of it, but I used to play more of it when I was in the United States, mainly because I could be guaranteed that at a golf course there'd be a nice place to walk. And I love living in Europe, where there are many pedestrian pathways to many beautiful places, but in the US, you can get many roads without even a pedestrian sidewalk. And so where do you walk? Most people just expect to drive. In any case, just to describe for you for a second, the inner game of golf for me, I remember playing with a friend, and I remember him not a good golfer like me, but he got so concerned and upset with the external circumstances of where he'd hit the ball. He'd hit the ball into the rough, or it was a good shot or a bad shot, and he got all riled up by the experience, by where the ball was going, and trying to improve his game. And what I'd figured out, and I think it's from a book called The Inner Game of Golf, was that I could just treat how I'd hit the ball and what was happening on the golf course as a kind of a backdrop. And what I could do was observe my inner emotions as I responded to what had happened with the ball. And then the inner game for me, as I would describe it, was managing my inner response to myself. So if I hit a good ball, obviously my emotions would soar, and I'd think that I was the smartest guy on the planet or the best golfer on the planet. And then I'd hit some lousy ball where I'd take a clod of earth with the golf club and not do very much. And my emotions would dive into the ground, and I'd feel all bent out of shape and angry with myself. And I started to see that what I could do, the inner game for me, was how do I react to those emotions? How do I see that in any game, I'm going to have moments where my emotions soar, and I'm going to have moments where I feel down in the dumps, and actually to kind of treat those two imposters as just the same, and to understand that this too shall pass, and to manage my equilibrium as those things happen is kind of the inner game. And it kind of is a far more serene way of living, and one can do exactly the same with investing. I think that for the book for a second, part of why I wrote in that direction and in that way is because it's the only thing that I felt qualified to write about. I was extraordinarily concerned to write a book that was worth it, that would stand the test of time. And not being a university professor, not having spent vast amounts of time studying quantum theory or the theory of prime numbers or the Riemann hypothesis or something, I knew that I could be an expert in my own experiences at effectively playing that in a game. Just to go to your last question of the desire to give, you discover that it's not about the wealth, it's about the inner game. So if we take the golf course analogy for a second, the wealth is the external thing. It's the internal reactions. Don't worry about whether you're worth $10, $100, $1,000, $1 billion, $1 trillion. Notice your reactions to how the world unfolds and become better at managing your internal reactions as if it's on the golf course. I think that if you take just going to the last bit about wanting to give all one's wealth back to society, if you extrapolate, if you take any amount of wealth to its logical conclusions and what the individual wants from that wealth. So my father has a great expression: how many steaks can a man eat? How many houses can we live in? How many first-class seats can we sit in? There's an extraordinary and quick limit that comes up in terms of wealth and one's personal circumstances. And if you continue with that kind of thinking, so we want a good education for our children, we want health for ourselves and the people that we care about, and then where do we go from there? And I think that, in an ideal world, I'd want my children's children and their children's children to have their rights protected, to be able to educate their children to live in happy circumstances, free from threat of physical violence, all of those things. And if you ask yourself, how do I best ensure that? The best way to ensure that is actually to live in and construct around you and support the most just, free society that one possibly can, because that's the only way to extend the reach of your influence far enough, because ultimately, your money becomes very limited if you start trying to give money to what? To your children, to your grandchildren, to their spouses. I mean, at some point, you're going to have to actually rely on the quality of the culture around you to take care of these people's best interests. And that was an evolution for me to get to. And I think that my wife grew up in Mexico and is half Mexican. And when I look in Russia and in Mexico, and you see these oligarchs, people who amass enormous fortunes, and I don't know any of those people, but I think that I'd want to ask them, what does this help you? What kind of protection for yourself can you buy with this fortune by just building homes and castles and hiring bodyguards and insulating yourself? The ultimate security and freedom comes from living in a place which is safe and secure, where people don't envy what you've got because they've got plenty themselves. And so, on that basis, I think that you do want to kind of reinvest it ultimately in the society that you're a part of.
I'm sure you must have faced enormous challenges along the way, right? Playing the game, the inner game, right? Or playing by your inner game, which actually takes me to what Buffett talked about, the inner scorecard, right? And you've not really just talked about it, you've actually lived through it, right? While going through your book, I came across this part where you said that you once promised yourself that you will never be more than, say, 5% of your capital into one stock, given that you are a risk averse, and that allows you to live a happier life. And also, you've also elaborated on how you've constructed your life, shifted to Zurich and built a life that you actually wanted to live with your family and in peace outside where you were living in New York in America. So what have been the challenges that you've really faced in living as per the inner scorecard? I want to bring this lesson from the Bhagavad Gita, right, which is one of the holy texts of Hinduism, which says that the war, right, the war that we talked about in Bhagavad Gita, which is the war of Mahabharata, right, it's a war within, right? We're always fighting within ourselves, with ourselves, right? And now you also, when you combine and when you extrapolate the things to outside you, right, the external world, investing, you talk about the fear of missing out. Yeah, you seeing your friends getting richer faster. You yourself are living in a society in Zurich, or in a place in Zurich, which I think you mentioned. You're surrounded by people who have more than enough, right? So how do you actually meet that challenge of continuing to play the game, your inner game, despite living in the society that you're living in, despite dealing with people that you're dealing with, and all that kind
Yeah.
of things?
Well, first of all, I think that not just I, but many people would take issue with the idea that I've faced real challenges. And there's actually, what you need to do with my book is go on the Amazon.com website and read some of the 1-star reviews, So some of the 1-star reviews, they kind of go, yeah, okay, so let's figure out this guy had a great education. He got some money from his friends and family and he invested in it. Big effing deal. Like, you give me that great education and get some money from friends and family, and I could do just as well. Which that review is a painful review for me to read, because I kind of like it's, I deliberately shared those details about myself to the reader because I wanted to give the reader as clear and honest a view of myself as possible. And I kind of wrote, and very few of the reviews I've written a response, but I kind of wrote and said, the only reason why you know these things is I volunteered to tell you. And you don't know how many countless big business biographies and autobiographies, they leave those salient details out, the unfair advantages that the person got. And so at least I'm sharing this with you out of the interest of honesty. So what real challenges have I faced? I recently rewatched the movie of Ramanujan, the famous mathematician. He faced real challenges. He had trouble getting writing paper. Those are real challenges. With Mohnish Pabrai, I visited the houses of some Dakshana scholars, and those are real challenges. I mean, literally mud huts with no flowing water or electricity. That's a real challenge. I don't think that. And just to go one step further, forget about growing up in relative wealth. Excuse me. It's also that I grew up with parents and embedded in societies which have extraordinary cultural wealth. I was telling my wife last night that generation of German Jews who existed in Germany before World War II were embedded in one of the most, German culture, for all of its faults, it is an extraordinary culture of, it had the best universities, the best technology, the best scientists. Before World War II, Germany had V2 rockets. And then you take on top of that, the culture of Judaism, German Judaism, and that in itself was extraordinarily elevated. So the idea that I've had hardship or difficulty, I think, is something that many people, including some of those 1-star reviewers on Amazon, would take issue with. But I think it's a beautiful idea, this idea that at the end of the day, everybody, no matter whether rich or poor, well or not well endowed, is engaged in this enormous internal struggle for the outcome of their lives. And that's something that we're all engaged with. And I think that one of the first things that I would urge all of the listeners and viewers of this conversation to take on board for themselves is to be forgiving of ourselves. So, in the Christian religion and somewhat in Judaism, there's this kind of quite a bit of emphasis of asking forgiveness. There's this idea that Jesus died for our sins, and I think that if we're going to use that idea well, and in Judaism there's a Day of Atonement, but the idea that we forget about others forgiving us, God forgiving us, we should forgive ourselves our shortcomings. And what do I mean by that? So we have an image of our North Star, an image of how we want to be, of who we want to be in the world. I have an image of who I want to be in the world, despite all my faults, despite all the 1-star reviews. And if it's an image that is worthwhile, I'm going to fall short of that, every day, effectively. And so then, what are we going to do with falling short of that? There's some people, but we can all get there. But some people have, and we don't see it from the outside, have mastered the ability to both see the gap between themselves and where they'd like to be, to know that they're pushing towards closing that gap, and are motivated and excited and happy with themselves to be pushing towards closing that gap without getting all upset about where they are and getting down on the fact that there is always that gap that's there. And I think so. My point to you is that, so when you look at the life of Guy Spier from the outside, you'll see, this is true of Guy Spier, and I think it's true of probably many other people, you'll see these big events like moving to Zurich, or changing the fee class, or a launch with Warren Buffett. And so what the biographer or what the external observer sees is these step jumps. And then what they do is they say, oh, that must be because he was educated at Oxford and got a first-class degree, or that must be because his father was rich, or this must be because. And that is a misattribution. And that is not it's a great way to tell a story, and it's an interesting way to tell a story, but it's not how progress actually happens. Progress happens because we're just kind of pushing in a certain direction every day. So I guess I want to take an example, first of all, from, and I don't know a lot about him, from the climber. Actually, it's funny, I keep thinking of Indian themes. It's the English guy who first climbed Everest, Sir Edmund Hillary. And we mustn't forget the Sherpa Tenzing Norgay, who was there with him, but because of our cultural imperialism, we all talk about Sir Edmund Hillary. We don't talk about Tenzing Norgay, who's up there with him, but whatever. But I asked myself this question, this thought experiment, and I don't know an enormous amount about him, but what we know is they climbed Mount Everest, and we go, oh my God, they climbed Mount Everest. They climbed the mountain, the tallest mountain in the world. How amazing. But I imagine Sir Edmund Hillary in London, or maybe with Tenzing Norgay in Kathmandu, walking into a climbing shop, examining climbing gear, looking at carabiners, those little metal things that hold ropes together, thinking, so the process of climbing Mount Everest was also a process of getting the best equipment, thinking through the best equipment, thinking through the best path, and you kind of imagine you and me, Vishal, standing in Kathmandu looking at Mount Everest. And the first thing we do is we think, well, we better get a good set of boots. The next thing we say, oh, well, let's try walking in some hills near to Mount Everest. And then we start saying, well, there's some ice walls there. Let's start practicing ice climbing. And now we start looking at pickaxes, and there's 1,000 different kinds of pickaxes. So that kind of thing gets broken down into so many minuscule steps. And, days where nothing happens, days where you're pushing in the wrong direction. But all the time, there's a kind of a progress that is taking place. And so I think that when I kind of see my improvement in terms of, for example, personal alignment, or ability to live by an inner scorecard, or where I've progressed to date in terms of living by an inner scorecard, those are not, those are kind of Mount Everests that one sees from the outside, but from the inside, it's a daily attempt to try to move towards an ideal, and to take, and to find the steps that will help me today to get a little bit closer to that ideal. And so if I think of the move to Zurich, for at least a decade before it happened, I was yearning for a simpler life. I was visiting the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, and I think that the thought had percolated in my mind, how do I find an Omaha of my own? And, New York City was not my little Omaha. It was the exact opposite. In fact, I used to liken living in New York City to the people I knew who were users or abusers of cocaine, in that they all said, I know it's unhealthy, it's a lot of fun, and I plan to stop, but not just now, maybe in a year or two's time. And I felt the same way about New York City. I kind of said, it's a lot of fun. I know it's not the healthiest place to live. I plan to stop living in New York, but not just now. But I did take my own version of little steps. So I started asking myself, well, before I moved to Zurich, I started asking questions, where would I move to? And I started developing shortlists of where I would move to. And I started developing relationships with those places. And I kind of would visit and I'd think, well, where would my children go to school? So I visualized what my life might be like in that place. And it was particularly easy to visualize what my life would be like in Zurich. So not dissimilar to, I'm sure that Sir Edmund Hillary visualized many, many times what it would be like to climb Mount Everest, and he rehearsed that in his mind. And that, again, is a kind of way of taking steps. And, you know, and I'll kind of come back to you with just this last thought, which is a fascinating thought. I mean, I think it was Tim Ferriss who asked himself the question, what would this look like if it were easy? How would it look if it were easy? And there's nothing wrong with asking oneself the question, you know, if I only had it in a scorecard, how would I be responding to whatever it is that we're talking about in the world? What's my point to you and to the listener is that you don't have to take these massive leaps into the unknown to kind of like get the end result right there, this, you know, this glorious result of an inner scorecard. You know, you might spend 5 years asking yourself the question, if I really did have an inner scorecard, what would my behavior look like? And it may be only after 5 years that you end up having the confidence to take that step. And so, yeah, small steps, lots of them, lots of knowing which direction one is headed and knowing that there'll be plenty of setbacks, but that's not a problem.
You mentioned about Mount Everest, right? So I think that took me to and the description that you gave of what Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay must be thinking, the steps that they had to take to climb Mount Everest, right? That took me to another person, George Mallory, right? Who also was one of the earliest people who climbed Mount Everest many years back. Right, and he wrote a wonderful book, Climbing Everest. Right, so I just want to take out time to read a passage to you. It's in my book, right? But I would want you to read a passage because it goes so much with the description that you gave of how we create a life and how we create a narrative around that, right? But there are a lot of steps, there are a lot of challenges, there are a lot of moving ahead and coming back again and again, which the world does not see. Right. So one of my favorite parts from Mallory's book is where he shares his reply to a question asked by a journalist about why he would risk his life to attempt to reach the daunting Everest. And his profound response outlines a powerful way to perceive life. Right. So this is what Mallory replies, and I read out that. Right. So he writes, people ask me, what is the use of climbing Mount Everest? And my answer must at once be, it is of no use. There is not the slightest prospect of any gain whatsoever. Or we may learn a little about the behavior of the human body at high altitudes, and possibly medical men may turn our observation to some account for the purpose of aviation. But otherwise, nothing will come of it. We shall not bring back a single bit of gold or silver, not a gem, not any coal or iron. If you cannot understand that there is something in man which responds to the challenge of this mountain and goes out to meet it, that the struggle is the struggle of life itself, upward and forward upward, then you would not see why we go. What we get from this adventure is just sheer joy, and joy is, after all, the end of life. We do not live to eat and make money. We eat and make money to be able to live. This is what life means and what life is for. So that was the passage, I think, which relates completely to what you mentioned just now, about your own experiences, about your own challenges. And since you talked about Everest, I just thought of sharing this.
Yeah. And that's passage in your book. That's so interesting.
That's in my book.
I didn't come across that. The only thing that I would diverge with, or the only thing, it's a pretty big thing really with Mallory, is that, I mean, a mountaineer takes that metaphor, which he puts so well, climbing a mountain is life itself, and lives it out in physical form by actually climbing the tallest mountain in the world and putting themselves through extraordinary danger. And actually, in order to experience the joy that they experienced in that journey of successfully climbing Mount Everest, you and I, Vishal, can experience that joy without climbing Mount Everest, without having our own, a more worthy direction, if you like. And I think that a big part of me says, forgive me, all mountaineers, and many mountaineers are friends of mine, how idiotic. If you know that you can get the joy of life and squeeze the best juice out of life by not putting yourself in harm's way, is that not better? And I think it certainly is better not to. And the point is to be on a journey of, becoming the best possible investor that I can be, and the best possible allocator of resources in the global economy that I can be. That is also a path of joy, which doesn't require me to risk my life on the sides of Mount Everest, And there are plenty of movies on Netflix which describe, for every successful mountaineer. I mean, it's not as bad as wingsuit diving, wingsuit jumping. You know what a base jump is, where these guys, they get a kind of a wingsuit and they jump off a cliff when there's a survival rate of like 50%. Every year, half of the people who do that seriously die. We don't have to do that. We can just live a meaningful life, if you like. So I also was going to say, as I went through that, kind of persistently taking small steps that are more likely to lead you close to your goal than move you away from your goal, is something that I realized that you understand 10,000%, Vishal, because you don't produce a book like this. I don't know if you can see it, without understanding things like that. That is the culmination of many years worth of, I don't know, I suspect that you did not start out all those years ago saying, I'm going to produce this book. You started out all these years ago saying, I'm going to study these people. I'm going to try and live that life. I'm going to try and help people around me live that life. And then, some steps down the road, you realize that you'd gathered the material together for a book. And then it would have been, so these things kind of unfold and grow as one makes effort in a particular direction. And I think that that's a worthwhile lesson, because that's not the way I thought 30 years ago. And too many people, I now have conversations with my children where they're kind of like thinking of the end point. They're like, well, if I take this step to the left, then I'm going to end up a doctor. And if I take this step to the right, I'm going to end up an engineer. And I'm not sure if I'd like to be an engineer or a doctor. Rather than just saying, well, given what you love to do, what step do you think is the most worthwhile step to take right now? And don't worry too much about where you end up, so long as you know that it's a good step. And then you see where you are from there.
Wonderful. So just a point more from Mallory, right? So someone asked him, why did you climb Mount Everest? So he said, because it's there, right? So taking that question forward, why did Guy Spier become a value investor?
There's elements in my own personality that I can't fully understand. I was looking at photographs, as one can, on Facebook of some school friends of mine, people that I knew when I was 16 or 17. And they took very different paths in life. I'm thinking of one friend of mine who, for him, making beautiful music and living in a world where he could make beautiful music and compose beautiful music was really, really important to him, and is really important to him. And a life without doing that for him is not the best and highest use of his life. And so I was in a school band with him. I played guitar and he played piano. It didn't help me that I was not a very good musician anyway. But I think that even if I had been a very good musician, I don't think I would have picked that path. For me, it had something to do with this idea of financial security. So some combination of greed and financial security and a desire to be a provider for myself and for my family, and that stuff came first. And I can tell you, Vishal, that I knew at a relatively young age that I was good at learning languages, and I really enjoy learning languages, and I'm the kind of person who picks them up quickly, and it's fun. It's really fun to do for me. But I figured out pretty quickly that there was no money in it. The best I could do was become a simultaneous translator, and that didn't strike me as a particularly good income. And I think that, I don't know if you've spent any time listening or reading Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson talks about the dominance hierarchies, and he goes back originally showing that 300 million years ago, lobsters evolved with dominance hierarchies, and that wiring is very well embedded in lobsters, and it's very well embedded in us as humans. And I think that I was ambitious to rise up as high as I possibly could up the dominance hierarchy of humans. And, we know that, I happen to be watching the unfolding crisis in the Ukraine quite closely. We know that Vladimir Putin thinks that he's at the top of the dominance hierarchy of the world, but we all know it's actually Warren Buffett, something like that. And I think that, if Gandhi had been around, maybe because of his extraordinary moral clarity and moral way of living, he might have been at the top of the kind of the generalized dominance hierarchy of who's the most respected person on the planet, or maybe Nelson Mandela if he was around. And so, so my interests were really quite, you could argue, quite reptilian or a crustacean. They were a desire to get ahead. I'm not some saint. I wanted to get ahead. I wanted to do well. I wanted to do what I'm programmed to do as a species, which is reproduce, attract the best mate by having more money and the ability to provide a nice lifestyle for that mate. All the normal things. And I think that what I found was that being a value investor, being around people like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, gave me a system to pursue that was consistent with the kind of personality I had, and very gladly was also consistent with the moral way of being in the world. There were people, if you think of Genghis Khan, who conquered half of Asia, his system was, conquer places with military force and then impregnate as many women as possible in the places that he'd conquered. So that's not a particularly, from the perspective of today, it's not a particularly moral system. The system that Warren Buffett has given us is the ability to rise in the dominant hierarchy, in that dominance hierarchy, without doing enormous damage to oneself or others, which seems like a really, really good deal. But just to be clear and to kind of re-answer your question, I'm not some saint. I approached the problem of how to get ahead in the world, how to rise up dominance hierarchies, and figured out that value investing was a pretty good system, way better than being Gordon Gekko or various other different kind of robber barons that have existed in the world to now. And, for what it's worth, and I think that this is where you and I have a common bond, and we have a common bond with so many other people. I once wrote I guess it was a kind of a blog post or article, but it didn't get much play. And so I'm going to try the idea again out here, is this idea that Warren Buffett is a kind of a philosopher of American capitalism, in that he's taken for me capitalism to a new place where you can get ahead by doing well. And so he's kind of like, it's an innovation. And I don't think that people in Russia, as you can see, Russia's on my mind these days, the system that developed in Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Russian Empire, they kind of thought of capitalism as more of a Gordon Gekko type get ahead and don't worry about everybody else because the free market takes care of that. And they didn't realize and don't realize that the forms of capitalism that we have in Western Europe, for sure, Scandinavian model is talked about, and also North America now, is one in which, you have the incentives set up in such ways that people who want to get ahead can try and get ahead. And in general, there is some side benefit, trickle-down benefit from that. But then we have a whole bunch of rules around fairness, around taxing people who make a lot of money and making sure that transfer payments are made to people who don't have a lot of money. So there's a whole bunch of fairness in the system. So Warren Buffett is I think he's a philosopher of American capitalism. He's brought it on a long way from where it was 100 years ago. And the ability to participate in that philosophy and to do well by doing good and being a moral actor in society is a wonderful opportunity. But sorry, Vishal, just to go back to it, let's make no mistake. I have buried inside me, there's a reptilian brain, there's a crustacean brain. At the end of the day, I'm no different to every human who wants to, get rich, provide for my wife and children, do all of those things that every person in history has wanted to do. And I'm with that wiring as well. It's just that value investing is a good system for doing it.
That's right. No, I completely agree with you that we are all same, right? We are walking on different paths, but we have almost similar kind of motives. But I think what differentiates people is how they choose to, or what kind of path they choose to walk upon, right? Like reading about your story about the principle of value investing, and you talk about incorporating value investing as a way of life, right? So when you try to do that, I think that's quite a stress-free, that quite a silent path. Unlike what most other people would want to walk upon in their wealth creation journey, right? Most people would want to be in New York, for example, right? Be in that hustle, be in that noise, surrounded by information, making decisions, trading in and out, speculating, taking on leverage, right? But the kind of journey that you walked, I think not many people would want to walk, because people are not really looking at compounding as a back-ended kind of a way of growing their wealth, right? We all want to be a front-ended, right? We all want to make money fast, right? So I think that is what differentiates, right?
One quick aside there is that there's a wonderful autobiography of Steve Schwartzman, who founded Blackstone, and he was clearly a very, very capable guy, way more capable than I am. And I think that he's been a very moral actor in the business world, but maybe if I'd had his skills, I wouldn't have needed value investing. If I'd have had all the skills to be a good robber baron of some kind or other, then maybe I wouldn't have needed Warren Buffett. But I didn't have those skills, so I needed to go with the Warren Buffett approach. So maybe go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, you. It may be that the path I chose was only optimal because of a whole bunch of skills that I lacked, a whole bunch of orientations that I lacked. If you can be Genghis Khan, then maybe being Genghis Khan is a lot of fun. But if you can't be Genghis Khan because you just don't have the same skills, then maybe you need a different strategy. I think it is a beautiful thing about the whole philosophy around value investing and living your life according to those precepts, not just to investing according to those precepts, is it's internally, or it's a consistent philosophy, in that everybody can live by that philosophy and everybody's better off. You can only have one Genghis Khan, because then you have lots of rape and pillaging going on, and you can't have everybody being a Genghis Khan, because then it's complete and utter anarchy. And I use the word Genghis Khan because I don't want to refer to people who are alive today who live their lives in a Genghis Khan-ish kind of way. But I think that, there's 50,000 of us who show up at Berkshire Hathaway meeting every year. We all have a similar philosophy, and the one doesn't detract from the other.
talking about the idea of connecting dots, right? So Steve Jobs has been like famously quoted for talking about that we only connect dots in the past and never in the future, right? So when you look back at your evolution as an investor, as a value investor over the past 25 years, which are those most important dots you can connect that brought you to what you are today as an investor, as a value investor, right? Of course, one I'm sure is getting to know Warren Buffett, right, and reading about Warren Buffett. Probably another could be Mohnish, right? So we're going to talk more about your relationship with Mohnish as well. But any other dots that you can think of that really led Guy Spier to become the kind of value investor that he's today, or the kind of person that he's today over the years?
I mean, it's a great question and can be answered in so many different ways. And I think that what comes up for me as you're asking it this time is I just, I send out chocolates to all sorts of people all the time, and you don't get them in India because the Indian postal system's not so good, Vishal. So we've given up sending chocolates to India because they all get stolen and an empty box arrives at the end destination. But in other countries it works, and we put a quote in, and this time we put a Winston Churchill quote in, success is never final and failure is never fatal. It's the will to continue that is decisive. I'm paraphrasing it, but it's a kind of along the lines of this something that is attributed to Persian wisdom and also to Solomon in the Bible, where this too shall pass. So if you're being successful, realize your success will not last forever, and if you're feeling an utter failure, remember that your failure will not last forever. But then one really important dot and a pattern that I figured out around the time that I'd read the Cialdini book on psychology of influence, and I was listening to a lot of Anthony Robbins tapes, was this idea of taking an action that is good, but then repeating it thousands of times, and having the faith to continue those actions even though they weren't paying any kind of immediate reward and there wasn't an immediate result that I was getting out of them. And so that kind of really did start setting me on a different path, and the ability to do those things almost fanatically and in a kind of half crazy kind of way. So I don't know if it's dots or if it's a dot. I don't know how you want to describe it, but if you take the Guy Spier of, I don't know, it must be around the year 2000. So I've kind of started my fund, but I kind of failed big time as an investment banker, and I've trashed my reputation, and I've understood that just trying to trade on either my university degrees or my smarts, whatever I had, was not going to cut it. So where did I need to go? And I'd come out of an environment where people who had formerly traded, people who'd been former drug dealers had been successful brokers at this firm, D.H. Blair, and I knew that they definitely didn't have the university degrees that I did. They definitely didn't have the smarts that I did, but somehow they were being more successful in life. And so I latched onto this reciprocation idea from Cialdini, and I just said to myself, and this is where I was kind of being slightly crazy, really. There's some part of me that was a little unhinged and is not capable of saying, well, that's a slightly ridiculous thing, and go and do it anyway. And so I just said, until I figure out something better to do, I'm going to generate as much positive reciprocation as I possibly can on the planet in any way, shape, or form. And so there were days in New York City, I kid you not, Vishal, I would have a packet of sweets, and every doorman who held the door for me, I would give him a sweet, and I'd just say, that's for you. And I'd do it for people in the street sometimes, and I would do it for people who there was no way that they could reciprocate. because I'd never see them again. But I'd also do it for the doorman in my building and for the person on the corner of the street. And so building up that power of reciprocation and just to trace that a little bit, I think that, and it really was a surprise to me, if you do that, you could also say just hold the door for people more often. You will get smiled at more often. Even in a city like New York City, you will find people smile at you more often. And so it's almost like the universe already started giving back to me just through those kind of like trying to generate reciprocation. And there was this kind of like, I believe that there was this sort of slow but growing realization that, generating that reciprocation as a matter of habit was kind of cool, because I can tell you that your mood is lifted if you have more people smiling at you. I mean, I'm sure that you could run the experiment. We could find some psychology department at some university to run this experiment. Just, find out, generate a control environment where the person gets smiled at 5 times a day, and another environment where the person gets smiled at 10 or 15 times a day. And I'm certain that, by all sorts of measures, subjective evaluation of mood, measurement of endorphins in the system, positive affect, the person who just gets more smiles in their life is going to be better off in 1,000 different ways, going to be healthier, going to make better decisions, going to have better prospects, going to smile back to other people a lot. What's my point? That simple idea of reciprocation and finding ways to engender good reciprocation, so kind of moral reciprocation, not manipulating people into doing things for you, but just generating a sense of goodwill, has been an extraordinarily powerful idea from which so much has flowed in my life. And that's just one of many that I guess I could bring up, but it just came up for me. So there you go.
As an example of reciprocation, I think you've written about it again as well. You started this ritual of writing thank you notes, right? That you claim that has changed your life. I receive your annual calendar as well and a note, right? So I must thank you for that as well. So tell me about the genesis of that idea of sending thank you notes in particular, and how has it impacted your life over the years, right? Of course, I'm sure you've received love and gratitude from across the world from people you may have not known, but you've sent thank you notes, right, to people you like who you may have never met again, right? Like you mentioned, who reciprocated, right, with a thank you note of their own, right? But how has it actually changed your life over years? How has the benefits compounded for you? The personal benefits, the personal happiness compounded for you, starting from a simple thank you note.
So I have 3 examples I'm going to give you of specific, tangible results. But before I do that, I'm going to turn the tables just a little bit, and I'm curious to ask you this question. Vishal, in the last year, can you think of a thank you note that you've received from somebody that you've never met?
I've received not a thank you note, but a lot of thank you emails from people I've never met, but who probably read my work, who found my work somewhere, or probably have been gifted the book somewhere. But the feeling has been amazing.
And have you subsequently met any of the people who wrote you a thank you email in real life after they wrote you a thank you email?
Oh, yeah, I think there have been a few people. I think a couple of them have become very close friends. I've been very close, become very close friends. Whether the relationship started simply with a thank you note or thank you email, right? So very close friendships have developed, right? So.
And that's my profound point to you, is that the people who sent you that thank you email, on one level of looking at it, they were sending a thank you email to Vishal Khandelwal. On another level of looking at it, they were actually writing a note to the universe. And the note to the universe was, Vishal Khandelwal is the kind of guy that I'd like in my life, because I think that he has so many good things to teach me. And by writing the thank you note to you, I'm going to just set up a hypothetical situation where you are in a room of 20, 30 people, and the person who wrote you that thank you note is also in the room. Now, out of all 20 people that you could have a conversation with, the person who wrote your thank you note has a huge advantage. They can come up to you and they can say, oh, Mr. Khandelwal, do you remember I sent you that thank you note? And then there's a small possibility that you might remember and your eyes will light up and you'll have a comment about it. And so you're already a step or two down the road in the conversation where the other people in the room are at zero, And so that sending a thank you note is a kind of a way, if we just go back to our climbing Mount Everest example, it's kind of like telling the universe, I'd like to climb Mount Everest, and you're inviting, say, Mount Everest a little closer into your life. So somebody sends you a thank you note. On the one hand, it is just a simple thank you note. On another hand, it's saying, I'm writing you this thank you note because I appreciate who you are in the world and I appreciate the work that you've done. And you're in a certain way my Mount Everest. And I don't know how I'll ever climb Mount Everest, but by sending you this thank you note, I make it just that little bit more likely, And so, and when you do that, 15 times a week, 500 times a year, 5,000 times over a decade, or maybe 10,000 times. But, that's 10,000 people out of a global population of 5 billion. And those 10,000 people are not average people. They're people with unusual abilities and qualities. I mean, you are in a position to transform somebody's life. Of the many thousands of people whose lives you might transform, that person who's written you a thank you note has increased that probability by just a little bit. So just to go into my life, it grew out of this idea of reciprocation. So, a gift of a chocolate or a sweet or a something is kind of like saying to the other person, I care about how you feel and I want you to feel good, just because the world is a happier place when you feel good. Well, a thank you note in a certain way does that and more, in that a thank you note is better than a physical gift. A thank you note is a thought wrapped up in an envelope and a piece of paper that is delivered to the recipient, doesn't require their time. They can decide when they want to open it. They can decide if they're ready to receive it. And once they've received it, having read it, they can receive it multiple times. They can put it up on a notice board. They can put it in a drawer. They can take it out. They can respond back. And the gift that you're giving it's a very unusual gift, and it's kind of maybe hard for somebody who hasn't been around it to describe. But what it's actually doing is it's saying, you are significant. You count. Your life has not been in vain. Your life has touched my life sufficiently strongly that I'm writing you this thank you note. And that feeling of significance that you can engender in somebody by a simple act of writing a note is extraordinarily powerful. We all want to feel our life is significant, even Vladimir Putin. And, it's one of the most simple things to do is to send a thank you note. Maybe if Vladimir Putin had received more thank you notes in his life, he wouldn't be launching missile tests and what have you. That's a side point. So 3 times when this has had an impact on me. So one of the first things, I got better at writing them. So what you don't want to do in a thank you note is ask for something. You're giving a gift. You don't engage, you give the gift, you don't engage in a matching scenario where you're trying to get something back in the same note. So you just give that gift away. And it's this kind of really exciting thing because you're kind of like sending this missive off into the universe. And you don't know if it'll ever come back to you. And in a certain way, it's not important because if it doesn't, you've still done a little bit of good for the recipient. So well-known story is the story with Mohnish Pabrai. I was in the habit of writing thank you notes. I'd attended his meeting, but I attended dozens of other meetings where I also sent thank you notes. So it wasn't like Mohnish's was the only one I'd sent. He happened to respond to my thank you note, and that was the universe saying, all right, we'll give you a gift back, Guy. You've been sending these love letters to the universe, and guess what? If you want to talk about in religious terms, God decided that he was going to give me back the gift of Mohnish Pabrai. But the way I like to see it, and the way I try to convince people when they're interns and I try and convince them to write these kinds of notes, is that it's not one thank you note. It was one out of 1,000. And, maybe God's wanted to say, well, let's see if you're willing to write 999 of these damn things. And then on the 1,000th one, I might reward you a little bit. So I had to have written all those other 1,000 before I got to the one and that set off a friendship. That set off reading Gandhi's autobiography, writing my book, meeting Warren Buffett. It all had its genesis with a thank you note. But I'll give you another example. So I had, as I said, I wasn't just sending thank you notes to Mohnish Pabrai. I was sending thank you notes to all sorts of people who had also graduated from Harvard Business School like I had. And one of the recipients was a guy, I didn't know it at the time, was a guy who was sitting on the board of the Harvard Business School Alumni Board. And there was a nomination process for free spaces, and I came up in his mind. And subsequently, and I ended up serving on the board of alumni board of Harvard Business School for 3 years. It was a wonderful experience for me. I learned a lot about how to run an educational establishment. I learned a lot about the business school itself. I learned a lot about admissions processes at American universities and met some great people. And one of the things I asked him, the guy who nominated me, I said, why actually did you nominate me? I mean, we hadn't even physically met at the time. He said, I remembered you well. You'd sent me this really nice note. And then I'd written back to you, and then we corresponded through holiday cards for 3 or 4 years. And so getting top of mind, that guy who writes you a thank you note, and then he finds you in the room with him, and it's so easy for him to float to top of mind. And so if you think of a statistical numbers game, if you can float to the top of people's mind more often, just a little more often than you otherwise would have, you're on a different path in life. And, you don't know when that path is going to manifest itself, but it will manifest itself at some point. So, so there's the Harvard Business School Alumni Board example, and there's a third example that's just gone out of my head. But it's not. They're not. Those are not the only. Those two, the Mohnish Pabrai and the Harvard Business School Alumni Board, are not the only two examples that I have in my life. And let's not forget, Vishal, that I'm just drawing causation where I can see it. But there are many other circumstances where I will not even be able to have seen the causation. So, and so here's an important, really, really important sort of practical insight for the listener. So, yes, I also every day, so no piece of correspondence, we have a rule that no piece of correspondence goes unanswered. That's probably a dangerous thing to say to your audience, because now a bunch of people will be trying me out on that. Now, we do triage it, so if it's purely fan mail, it might take a while for me to respond. And if it's something of specific importance and urgency, I might respond sooner. But there are many ways. So when I say thank you note, that in a certain way is a kind of a shorthand, because I didn't want to spend 3 chapters in the book writing about all the different ways that it happens. But here's a fun one, especially for all the investment analysts. So it's easy enough for us to get transcripts of conference calls. We all read transcripts of conference calls. They're interesting and they're valuable. But, and now maybe many people will do it. Now I've developed a habit for myself is, after I've read the conference call, I circle the 2 or 3 questions, or during the reading of it, the 2 or 3 questions that I think are the most pertinent and interesting ones. And then I search up the questioner on LinkedIn and I send them a note. And I say, Dear X, I really appreciated your question on this XYZ corporate conference call. And they love it. Not all of them, but many of them love it. And again, I'm just giving out a little bit of warmth and love. And so just one other practical thought, and there are many of these practical thoughts. And so, what am I sharing with you here is, you start off with the Everest of, the more people appreciate me on the planet, the more likely I'm going to be successful. In the same way that, there's some analogy there to climbing Mount Everest, if you like. What do I need to climb? Well, I need to be fit. So I'm going to spend every day walking. I need to have good climbing shoes. I'm going to find the best climbing shoes. I need to have a good guide. I'm going to find the best guide. Those are all processes. And so I want to create valuable and powerful reciprocation on the planet. And what I'm sharing with you now is, once you start with that idea of a North Star and you start off writing physical thank you notes, and then I discover there are other ways to do it. And so I'm kind of like expanding. For example, the LinkedIn idea is another way to do it. At first, I used to write thank you notes with a request. I can't, how many countless, and the request would be, I hope to meet you one day, or I hope that you will consider investing in my fund, or some idiotic thing. And then I kind of, over time, learned that was not the best way to write a thank you note. What's my point to you? You can see the same kind of refinement of technique, if you like, in the same way that, the climbers who climbed Mount Everest would have refined their techniques over time until they'd started with nothing of any unusual ability or insight. And then suddenly they were real experts at climbing Mount Everest. So I've become, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I've gone down a significant learning curve on the thank you note stuff. I would just share this with you. Nothing that I've learned on that front beats what I know that Warren Buffett already knows. And I feel quite certain of that. And so I send out these rather elaborate holiday cards, which I really enjoy putting together and designing with a really talented designer. And this year, not every year, Warren Buffett sent me a holiday card. And it is a simple picture of him just on one side. And it's a kind of humorous picture. And it's got a note from him written on the front, designed to be framed. Designed to be framed. Because, of course, I'm so super excited to get a holiday card from the great Warren Buffett. And, of course, here I want to boast about it to you and tell you how wonderful it made me feel. And so he's kind of doing the same thing. He kind of bundled a little piece of joy in a holiday card from him to me, and he sent it to me. How awesome. And so what's my point? I've gone a long way in terms of learning about reciprocation, but I'm still not as high as Warren Buffett has gotten to. He still knows more about that stuff than I do.
I'm sure. I think just this idea of, reciprocity that you talked about in writing thank you notes, right? I picked it from you, right? I have not been so active, though I thank everyone who I come across in real life. But yeah, just last year, after publishing the book, I think the first two copies I sent to Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger, just as a thank you letter, and along with a thank you letter for everything that they've taught me over the years indirectly. And I received an email from Debbie, Mr. Buffett's secretary, and a handwritten note from Mr. Munger himself saying that he liked the book. So I think that put me on cloud nine, right? So I was extremely elevated over at that point of time. So,
but I'll tell this to you, and I've said it to interns, but I don't think one intern's done it. But maybe you'll repeat it to your audience, and then somebody in your audience will do it. So you sit down, write 20 notes to the 20 teachers 20 teachers in your life, including school teachers, and even the teachers you hated. You just write a note saying, "Dear X, I remember our mathematics classes," or "You were my maths teacher in 5th grade, and I just wanted to thank you for your teaching." You don't even say I had an impact. It's a beautiful thing to do. It's a really, really beautiful thing to do. It doesn't matter if you get a response. And I think that one point to you is that, and I think that, look, in a certain way, what you've written in this book is a thank you to the universe. You're kind of saying, "Dear universe, thank you for all these amazing lessons. I feel so lucky to have learned these lessons. I'm going to thank you in the form of a book." And so there are thank you notes does not necessarily mean that you have to be sitting and writing individual notes. But I think that, and I don't know you well, Vishal, but I have no doubt that the process of writing this book changed you on the inside. And I think that perhaps the most spiritual side of this process of thank you notes is that I never expected was the way it would change me. And I actually found myself caring more about these people I was writing thank you notes to. And I found, and again, it's this idea that not through one note or 10 notes, but in over however many I've written over a lifetime, the moment when I'm writing the note, when I'm signing my name, when I'm thinking of something special to say to that person, I'm holding that person dear, and I'm holding that person as a focus of my attention, even if it's a very, very short time. And I didn't realize that that would exert an internal rewiring process by which I actually cared just a little bit more about that person for sure, and also about humanity in general. Because I find it fascinating that this kind of like subtle efforts on a repeated basis can really have some profound personality changes. And I think that when I look at, I think that the religions that kind of giving the injunction to somebody to pray every day, and some religions give you specific texts to pray to or to repeat every day. It's unbelievably subtle, but if you do it, then you sort of become what the texts are trying to get you to become. And I'm thinking about this. It's Warren Buffett who said it, that the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they're too heavy to be broken. And that becomes destiny in a certain way. So I actually think to get up every day and read Rudyard Kipling's poem If, which we all know, you become a different person if you keep doing that. A great Indian friend who used to work at Markel, Sarab Madan, has a great collection of affirmations. I know that you recently talked to Arnold Vandenberg. He's a master of this stuff. Simply affirming. So in a certain way, a thank you note is also a kind of an affirmation of something on a daily basis. It's an affirmation of something that I appreciate and respect in the recipient of the thank you note. And so powerful, powerful tools, incredibly powerful tools. And just one more thought before I hand the mic back to you. One of the most frustrating and in a certain way depressing conversations I had with somebody who was a kind of a mentee, I guess, in that, I kind of said, look, why don't you do this strategy for your life? And the person's answer was, oh, that's never going to work, And my answer was, well, if you don't have a better strategy, why don't you go with this until you figure something better out? And the person didn't, it's probably never good to tell somebody what to do, but this person was coming to me for advice and was asking me in quite an insistent manner, and they didn't have any better ideas. And so that was kind of annoying for me and kind of depressing for me. But at the same time, it's such low-hanging fruit, and so many people will fail to do it, that it's just such an extraordinary opportunity for those of us who do succeed in doing it. And then just one more idea, sorry, before I hand the mic back to you, is if you do this, you got to be willing to do it for, I would say, at least a decade before any real tangible results come into your life. And I think that many people kind of give up. They write 3 thank you notes, and that you actually have to be dedicated to doing it on a regular, consistent basis. And because the rewards are going to be so random and infrequent and unexpected when they come, you have to develop a different motivation for doing it. You have to do it. It started for me out of some kind of a madness, and then out of the good feeling that I got out of it. And then the kind of like the results, like Mohnish Pabrai or board of Harvard Business School, alumni board of Harvard Business School, those were kind of like extraordinary benefits that came down the road. I think that so many of the most worthwhile investments that one can make in one's life would never pass a marketing department's or education, human resources department's ROI numbers. They just say, well, that's just like, we need a return in at least 5 years, and you're telling that this thing might not even earn a return before 10 years. They're like, nah, nix that, not doing that. And in a certain way, that's an enormous and extraordinary opportunity. So many people will say, well, that's never going to work. And it's like sort of awesome that you think that, because I'm going to go ahead and do it. And, it's going to make me rather unusual in the world.
So, yeah, wonderful explanation that, Guy. Thank you so much for sharing your insights over there. Apart from the idea of thank you notes, right? So one of the other, right? So I've the best ideas that I've picked out from your book, right, over the years of reading it multiple times are again not related to investing, but yeah, applying the value investing principle to life, right? How do you do that? How have you done that? So another idea, which is probably my best idea from your book, is that of compounding goodwill, compounding personal goodwill, right? Where you take the idea of the power of compounding to beyond money, right? So, how have you practiced in your life, and the results you have seen over the years of practicing it? Though the results are probably the last thing that I should be talking about, because we don't. As I understand, you don't want to compound goodwill to expect some results out of it, right? But what has been your experiences over there?
But in a certain way, so money is the tip of the iceberg. There's this massive iceberg below the waterline that nobody sees. And, money is just one example of what arises above the waterline if you're getting all these things right below. And so I think that wealth in all its forms, including financial forms, does flow from this kind of broader concept of compounding not just financial wealth, but goodwill, which is maybe a catch-all for all the other good things that one can compound and one ought to compound. And one of the ways that I've enjoyed talking about this, and I hope, Vishal, that the analogy works for you, because it requires a little bit of a leap of the imagination, but the example would be, imagine for a second that all ownership of property has been reallocated equally around the planet. And so no physical assets have been destroyed, but let's just say that all of the shares of Berkshire Hathaway, the corporation still exist, have been reallocated to every single person on the planet. All the shares of Coca-Cola, all the shares of every single company is Google, Microsoft. And that goes for the ownership of all real estate and other things. And let's just argue for a second that everybody's been removed from their current job. So Warren Buffett is no longer the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. He's just a human being on the planet but he's starting at zero in his personal wealth account, the same way that I'm starting at zero. And now we ask, who's going to compound wealth faster for their bank account and their kind of net worth account? And I don't think it's hard. I don't think I'm an unaccomplished person, but I don't think many people would disagree that Warren Buffett is going to do it faster. And the question is why? And because he got no money in this hypothetical view of the world. And the answer is that he's got all these non-financial assets. He's got all these people who are willing to trust him, all these people who want to do business with him, all these people who know that if they engage with him, he's going to treat them as great partners, and all of those things. So that is the kind of even though the financial numbers are in this hypothetical world equal, the prospects for Warren Buffett versus me are very, very different, based on this hidden thing that we don't really measure and we don't really look at. We have a sense of what it is. That's this goodwill idea. And so I think that my experience so many times has been that the direct route is not the best route. It's the indirect route. So if we compound goodwill, and I'll describe what I think of as goodwill, then I think that one of the consequences is financial well-being, financial plenitude. And so going for financial plenitude directly is not necessarily going to get you the most financial plenitude that if you go indirectly and do this goodwill idea. So what is the goodwill idea? We can talk about one's social relations. Do people want to do business with you? Do they want to, when they have the thought of who to invite onto the alumni board, or who to invite into their deal, or who to give a call to show something interesting to, are you the first person who they think of, or are you the last person that they think of? And how do you make yourself into the person that who becomes the first person on people's list to think of and call? And so, how does one develop the qualities to be that first call? I mean, can you imagine, in the hypothetical world, just going back to it, Warren Buffett opens his partnership and Guy Spier opens his partnership. And so we both say, hi, folks, we're open for business. And, the partnership terms are the same for both our partnerships. And imagine for a second that I'm equally intelligent to Warren Buffett, which I'm not, but let's just imagine that I am. He's going to get a ratio of 1,000 to 1, 10,000 to 1 people wanting to invest with him to people wanting to invest with me. Because I'm not an unknown quantity, but Warren Buffett's a better known quantity. People are more likely to know that they'll be treated fairly by him than treated fairly by me. And so, this comes down to, I guess it's the golden rule of treat people the way you'd like to be treated. That comes down to very specific things. If you see that somebody's made a mistake and it's in your favor, correct that mistake and help them to see that mistake, not because you'll win in the moment, you'll actually lose in that moment because you will have not received something that they'd inadvertently given to you, but because it's going to make them want to come back and do more with you in the future because they know that you're going to be treated fairly. Treat what they tell you as confidential. Don't take what they tell you and share it with the planet unless they've given you permission to share it with the planet. That's going to make them want to tell you more things in the future. Don't tell people what to do. If you don't tell them what to do, they're more likely to share their problems with you because nobody likes being told something. They like to learn. They want somebody else to share experiences. So it comes down to, those are all the kinds of ways in which one can sort of grow goodwill, increase the likelihood that people want to come back and play the game of life with you rather than with somebody else. And I guess I'm drawing a little bit on a couple of great books. Excuse me, one by a guy called James Carse and another by a guy called Simon Sinek, both talking about the infinite game. Life is an infinite game. Investing, business, and life are infinite games. And I won't go into the detail. It's very worth reading those books. But there is lots of evidence that shows that even animals in rough and tumble games of play fighting will choose to lose to their opponent, their weaker opponent, because if they win every time against their weaker opponent, the weaker opponent will give up and not come back and play the game. And so when you show that you're willing to play not just fairly by the rules, but you're actually willing to give your opponent an advantage, then they want to play with you, and that's a kind of a social capital or goodwill. One can go into the multifarious ways in which we can invest in goodwill. I'll just share a couple more with you. I think that graduate university networks, when they're first formed, when everybody who's a classmate is just out of school, those networks are not particularly valuable because nobody in that network is doing anything of unusual or special interest. But then, as everybody's careers develop, some of those people end up in positions of power and influence, and suddenly to be embedded or enmeshed in that network is something that's particularly powerful. So, there are behaviors that one can engage in with one's contemporaries and one's peers to make sure that one is embedded in the most powerful, valuable network around. And so that can go from, if somebody who knows a good person is down and out, has had a rough time, everybody goes through a rough patch. That's a particularly auspicious time to reach out to them. And again, in the direction of sort of thank you notes, you don't have to actually afford them any actual help. Just an affirmation to them, hey, you're a good person, you're going to get through this. And I want you to know in this moment when you're down and you don't have many friends, that I appreciate you and I know that you're going to come out very well on the other side, can be enough to strengthen those ties that when in the future they are in a different place, they will remember you well. But then an even more simple thing, I mean, I have this Value X conference. One of the things I do at the Value X conference, and one of the behaviors that I encourage in the participants, is just help each other be more successful. If you embed yourself in a network of people who are just 1% more successful than they would have been had you not been embedded in that network, how much better is life for everybody in your network and ultimately for you? You know, I joked to the conference, I don't need to have a yacht, a big fancy yacht, but I'd like all my friends to have a big fancy yacht. You know? So I don't need one, but you guys all need one. And when you have it, maybe one or two of you will invite me onto your yacht. That would be just fine. Thank you very much. So all of those behaviors, which in a certain way appear to have little to do with making a lot of money, actually have everything to do with making a lot of money. Because, and just, you know, and one other thought, and I'm kind of, I guess I'm not ranging around because all this stuff is interconnected. Another way to summarize all of these behaviors is to say, hey, I plan on being really successful, and both as a way of achieving that success and as a way of being happy with success, I know I need to deserve it. And so I want, when I get there, for people to say, wow, he really deserves it. And therefore, I got to start engaging in those behaviors now, and to make sure that people feel like I deserve it when I get there. And in my case, I really am kind of determined to help every single person in my life become, you know, anywhere from 1% more successful to 5x or 10x or 100x more successful because I was in their lives. And I'll take you to an example of Warren Buffett doing this. Of course, a common theme through this conversation in our lives, I think, Vishal, is that there's no lesson that I've learned that I don't realize when I've learned it, that Warren Buffett hasn't already learned it. And I'll tell you a story that I know in its broad outlines is right, although I'm going to get details wrong, and I really ought to have, I'm sure there's something in the public domain about it, but I remember it was in the late 1990s, receiving a copy of, I believe it was Forbes magazine, and this was an unusual copy of Forbes in that it had two CEOs on the cover. So Forbes was well known for putting, you know, businessman of the week effectively on the cover, and they take somebody who'd been in the news who was a big deal. And in this case, it had the CEO, I think, of US Bank Corp on the front. And then there was a second glossy cover behind it, which was Warren Buffett. And, or maybe it was the other way around. Warren Buffett was the outer cover and the CEO of US Bank was the inner cover. And the way I remember the story was that Forbes had wanted Warren Buffett on the cover. And Warren Buffett had said, I really don't want to go on the cover, but here's the CEO of US Bank, put him on the cover. And of course, Berkshire Hathaway had a big shareholding in US Bank. And you know, there would have been a to and fro, and this was written up somewhere. And at the end of the day, what they agreed was that they would both go on the cover with their own separate pages. And now think of the CEO of US Bank, and he's got Warren Buffett as a shareholder. And, you know, he would not merit, or the editorial board of Forbes would not have thought to invite him onto the cover. But now, because Warren Buffett is insisting, and the editorial board, the only way they can get him on the cover is to also put this guy on the cover. He knows the story, and he's found his way to the cover of Forbes magazine, and that's an extraordinary thing for him and burnishes his reputation. And so what did Warren Buffett do for him? Warren Buffett did for him something that, you know, is in no way, can you reciprocate that? You know, it's a kind of like a gift. It's like giving life to your children. It's like there's no way they can reciprocate. The only thing they can do is go on and give life to yet more children or something like that. There's no way that the CEO in this story of US Bank Corp can thank Warren Buffett enough. There's no thing that he can do that can reciprocate that. So what did Warren Buffett do? You know, there's so many layers of intelligent behavior there. You know, this is kind of like, if we just, and forgive me because I'm belaboring the point, but I think it's probably worth belaboring the point. it's kind of like a micro-analysis of a master move by a master, in that, he's promoting one of his CEOs. Now, he would only do it if he admires the guy and likes him. He's burnishing his reputation as the CEO of the bank, which is a good thing for the bank. He's burnishing the reputation of the bank. He's also creating an extraordinary friendship between him and the CEO of US Bank. And so he was, it's those kinds of actions. When I go back to the original hypothetical story of who you're going to invest with, Warren Buffett or me, I've not done as many of those kinds of things in my life. But it's those kinds of things that create the desire to do stuff with Warren Buffett. And I have a friend who works in private equity, and I asked him, how many of your CEOs have you managed to get onto the front cover of, here in Switzerland, there's a magazine called Bilanz? And he said, none. And I said, why not? Because actually, if you get them onto the front cover of Bilanz, which is kind of a Forbes in Switzerland, just think of how many CEOs are going to want to talk to you at cocktail parties. How many CEOs are going to want to get in front of you? That's kind of like building goodwill, building your social capital in a way that is going to pay enormous dividends down the road. And I think that once I started thinking of the world in that way, I started seeing myriad ways of doing it. And I do try to do it in all sorts of ways, small and big. And it makes my life super exciting because I keep finding new ways to do it. And I keep reaping the rewards of ways in which I've done it in the past, which now, for one reason or other, are coming to fruition. So it is, growing goodwill is the idea that is just so powerful and just keeps giving. That's a North Star, if you like, an extraordinary North Star. And just imagine it when we come to the financial side of things. Growing goodwill is it's growing the iceberg below the waterline. And if you keep growing the iceberg below the waterline, it cannot help but float up. It cannot help but do that. If you keep doing those kinds of things, like the story that I mentioned, for people around you, it's just going to be inevitable that you will end up living in a world of plenty and in a world of financial freedom and financial excess, even, if you like. And what an exciting idea, and how powerful. And you get that by doing good for others, So
I think the thing about Warren Buffett, as like you mentioned, is right, we can talk for hours and hours and hours, and we'll still not really reach the end of the kind of lessons that we've learned from him. So here I want to talk to you about the lunch you and Mohnish had with Warren, right? In 2007, if I remember right. And you've spoken and written about what he advised you on investing in life. So my question is, what did you observe of Warren Buffett when you met him? What were those silent qualities of his that may not be covered by the media or through his investment performance, but only come out when you meet that man in person?
Yeah, and so the best way for me to answer that is, obviously, I'm not going to pretend to be objective, because I don't think that's as valuable for you or for the audience. I think that the best thing that I can do is, what you have to hear as the audience is, this is the reaction of the personality who is Guy Spier to Warren Buffett. And so it's not an objective view of Warren Buffett, it's how Guy Spier reacted to him. And I can just give a few of those things, and if you meld them with my personality, that perhaps provides you with insights. And so I remember feeling just more than mildly, I was super nervous, and I felt more than just a little mildly crestfallen when he kind of like says hello to me, but then it goes straight to my wife, because it turns out that my wife was born in Salisbury, North Carolina, which is where Warren Buffett had a great friend, Fred Stanback. And so he immediately turns to Laurie and says, oh my God, you were born in Salisbury, North Carolina. Do you know, I think Lion is a kind of well-known supermarket there. It's a tiny place in North Carolina. And what's my point to you is that, I lived in Iran and born in South Africa and lived in Israel and speak these languages. And, And that was at least in that moment, it appeared to me that was of no interest to Warren Buffett. He kind of just thought it was cool that my wife had been born in this town where he'd spent quite a lot of time with a friend. And so I think it kind of like reveals this side of Warren Buffett that's extraordinarily normal and is extraordinarily hometown type of guy. He's that Salisbury is not in the Midwest, but he's very, very much a Midwesterner. And he's very much comfortable with being a Midwesterner and doesn't seek to be more in the world. And that was something that I didn't quite understand as well as I do now. So there's one thing. A second thing was this sort of, I've never spoken to somebody who I feel like mind is processing what I'm saying 8 different ways as I'm saying it. And I've had conversations about this feeling with Alice Schroeder, and who wrote the Snowball book about Warren Buffett. And she's kind of described to me, she kind of identified with that and said, yes, absolutely, that's the case. And so his mind works at a higher clock speed than mine. And Vishal, I don't know if you have the experience. I think I can distinctly tell when somebody's mind has a higher clock speed than mine, because there is this phenomenon that their thought envelops mine. I think that there's some element of it which is just that he's older, more experienced, more wisdom, but it's not just that. There's something else going on and I can tell you that was a very hard feeling for me, because I went into the meeting really hoping against hope that somehow I'd come out of it saying, oh, I've got as good a brain as he does. And I'm not a dumb guy, but, and I've joked, sort of like Warren said, you don't need the extra IQ points to be a good investor. And my answer is, great, Warren, give me those extra IQ points. If you don't want them, I'll take them very gratefully. Even if it doesn't make me an investor, I'll really very happily take those IQ points. Thank you very much. But so that was an extraordinary feeling for me. Something that Alice Schroeder harps on a little bit about in the book is that at least for some period of his life, Warren was incredibly miserly. And that was not my experience of him at all in any way, shape, or form. I didn't experience him as miserly. He gave the waiters at the end of the meal some enormous tips. I could just see by the rolls of money that he had, and they were not $1 bills, they were $20 bills. But also, he was extraordinarily generous with us, not just with his time, and it was, 3.5 hours that we were hanging out together, but he understood that I was nervous. He wanted to put me at my ease. I remember at one point he put his hand up and he said, "Hey, Guy, you're still calling me Mr. Buffett, but I just want you to point out to you that Monsoon and Momachi and Monsoon, Mohnish's children, have started calling me Warren. And I know that by the end of the lunch, you're going to be calling me Warren. So really, just start doing it now. It's going to make all of our lives a lot easier." And he was kind of saying, "Hey, I know you're nervous. Just relax. It's okay." And that's kind of a generosity of spirit. He didn't have to do that. And so, I think that being generous in that way is this idea of building goodwill. It's smart. It's long-term greed. It's smart to be generous in that way. And so that was something that was interesting for me. The last thought that I will give you on that topic before you come back, and you're certainly welcome to ask me more, is that I think that all of my subsequent thinking and experiences around observing Warren's behavior, I now fit it into the prism or into the lattice work of understandings that includes all of those kinds of experiences that I'm describing. And I think that all of those things enable me to perceive his personality with greater 3D effect, with greater precision, which means that I kind of imbibe the lessons of what he's able to teach far more clearly. So the benefit is not so much at the lunch itself, although I had many, many experiences and emotions at the lunch itself, but it's that, we humans, there's this concept from psychology of mirror neurons where we really have this extraordinary mental apparatus in that we can model how other people will react. We have a model in our minds of how other humans react to the world, and we can kind of, it's not that we can predict, but we have kind of a sense of how different humans will react to what we do, and that's this power of empathy, and there's a whole part of the brain that's dedicated towards doing that. And in my book, I write, I ask myself the question, what would Warren Buffett have done in my shoes? And Charlie Munger talks about having as your mentors the eminent dead. They don't have to be alive. But in order to have these people as your mentor, you have to have a very good model of how they would react in different circumstances, what they would say or do, even if they're not actually physically present or don't even understand the circumstances. And I think that the experience of that lunch has allowed me to better model Warren's reaction. And so to go to briefly, you asked me a question earlier about inner scorecards. How does one develop that inner scorecard? Well, I can tell you, one does not pluck it out of thin air, and one is not just born with it. It's having the intent to have an inner scorecard. And then if you take that kind of model of Warren Buffett's personality that I now carry around with me, that because of my readings of the biographies, but then finished off or added to by having actually experienced him in real life for that lunch, the model is more powerful in my head. It's more powerfully ingrained. Its voice is a little louder. I see it and feel it a little bit more clearly. And therefore, it can have a greater gravitational force on things like decisions as to where to live or how to behave within an inner scorecard. So that sort of gravitational force that happens on that, the power of being in the presence of that person, that all my sensing organs are kind of taking in who he is and helping me to internalize that. That's an enormous benefit from the lunch. I think my point to you and the listener is, it is not a dumb idea to make a pilgrimage to be in the physical presence of somebody that we admire. If we have somebody as a role model, it is to travel a long distance, to be in their presence, to really use all one's senses to take in who they are, to understand, to be able to model them better when they're not around us, is a very, very powerful thing to do. And I think I've not done enough of it in my life, actually. Nowhere near enough of it. And don't be the person who says, oh yeah, that guy's a great hero, but it's not worth traveling to visit them. I'll not even get to shake their hand. And I think that actually at the Berkshire meeting, that is a big part, or the Daily Journal meeting that we talked about, that is a big part of why people are there. They want to be able to internalize who Charlie Munger is. And you can do that better when you're in the room with him, even if you're sharing that room with 3,000 other people or 50,000 other people, as in the Berkshire meeting.
No, I completely relate to, I think, just the experience of taking that pilgrimage. And like I mentioned to you, I visited the Daily Journal Corporation AGM in 2018, just to be in the company of Charlie Munger, right? Just to be present in that room where Charlie's talking about his ideas on living a good life, on becoming a good decision maker. Though you can read it through his lectures, through his books, and listen to him on the internet, but just the presence, right, I think makes a lot of difference. I completely agree, and I would look forward to attending Berkshire sometime in the future. From Buffett to your friend Mohnish, right? So in your book, you've dedicated a chapter to Mohnish, who supposedly is your best friend, about what you've learned from him over the years. You and Mohnish have been friends for over 15 years, as I understand, and he's a great investor and a human being too. What have been your biggest learnings from him? Also, where do you disagree with him?
Yeah. in many ways, and it's not the first time I've said it, but it really does percolate for me and becomes really quite important. I've learned more from Mohnish than I have from Warren. And I'm not saying that Mohnish is kind of in any way superior to Warren, but I've had more opportunity to learn from Mohnish. I mean, if you would have given me a couple of years, like some of his lieutenants, to work in the same office as Warren, then maybe I would have learned more from Warren. But I've had so much more exposure to Mohnish, and that exposure really has benefited me enormously. And so the Mohnish is an extraordinary businessman. He's got an extraordinary set of, first of all, just practical skills, but an extraordinary set of psychological tools that he brings to the process of business that I think invariably he learned the vast majority of them from his father, who himself was a very unusual personality. I never met his father, but he brings up wisdom, especially in times of adversity, that he learned in his father's household and in conversations with his father around the businesses that his father had. And I think that in many people's psychology, so the capacity to be tough while at the same time not being grasping and unfair, to accept the toughness of the world. The world is a tough place. People do try to mug other people on street corners in one form or another. People do try to take advantage. In many ways, there are many parts of the planet which are dog eat dog, as they say. To exist in a world where those kinds of things can happen, but to have an enlightened response. I've seen Mohnish with those enlightened responses in all sorts of different meetings with, mainly actually in India, not just in India, but, in India, you have the Dakshana shirt on, which is going to make Mohnish very happy. But in meetings at times with ministers or people in the Ministry of Education, and it's unusual and special. And I think that, for example, I had read Cialdini, but I did not understand the power of consistently applying these ideas and finding ways to develop an engine that applies these ideas. So, I remember sitting on an airplane with him, an internal flight in India, and I had nothing to do but maybe read an annual report or a book, and he was signing holiday cards to people, which are a form of thank you note. And he was taking the opportunity to do that. And I remember just feeling a sense of, wow, why aren't you doing that, Guy? And the understanding that out of 100 people that you engage with in an open and honest way, 20 are going to go and try and take advantage. And that's okay. You just delete them out of your life, and not getting bent out of shape and not trying to get revenge and not trying to kind of get one up on them, but just to say, okay, I learned something about them and I can make sure I don't get in touch with them with all that much alacrity in the future. And so an enormous amount that I've learned from Mohnish about how to be in business. And a part of it is simply applying the laws of large numbers in one's own life. So, the understanding that out of every 100 letters or every 100 attempts at something, you're going to get at least 5, if not 20, thorough rejections. And I remember him telling me the story that most people will take the first rejection, get super depressed for 3 weeks and not do much. And then they'll try again, and they'll gradually work their way through 100 people. But if you take this perspective that that in this hypothetical example, 20 out of 100 are going to result in rejections, but you engage in strategies to make sure you get to the 100 reach outs to people in spite of the 20 rejections, and you set your environment up in such a way that those aren't going to get you down, you're at a huge advantage over the guy who gets terribly depressed over each rejection. These are kind of very simple ideas. They're very practical ideas. They've got nothing to do with the kind of moral philosophy and other highfalutin subjects that I studied at Oxford, but they are far, far more useful practically. And I just didn't have that practical knowledge, and he gave me an enormous amount of that practical knowledge. In terms of something that I disagree with Mohnish on, I think that I have a far more jaundiced view of the world outside of North America and Western Europe and one or two other countries, in that I think that I probably see those worlds through too much of rose-colored glasses with the theory of how things ought to work optimally. And I once had an investment in Jordan that my friend Mohnish thoroughly approved of. And I think that I was very significantly underestimating the very real political risk that existed in Jordan. And I think that Mohnish is far more willing to kind of see past the political risk in countries that he's invested in. So we both had investments at a certain time in Argentina. I think that Mohnish would, without any problem, repeat those investments in Argentina. I'm not sure that I would. I'm not sure that I would repeat my investment in Jordan. It's, I think, relatively well known that Mohnish has been to Turkey multiple times and is excited about that country's economy. And I have enormous respect for many businesses and businessmen, especially in Istanbul, but I'm far more wary of investing in that country. And even though I did spend some of my life in the Middle East, growing up in Israel and living in Iran, I think that he's kind of far more willing to take on the risks associated with that, and I kind of find myself not willing to take any of those risks. So that would be one place where he and I diverge probably greatly. I would tell you as well that so there are some people who are very good salespeople but aren't very good analysts. And there are plenty of people who are very good analysts who can't sell. But he's very, very capable of both and so much more. And through that, he gets extraordinary relationships with extraordinary people, because it's that combination of having great insights, but also presenting himself in a way that makes him an attractive person to some pretty powerful and extraordinary people. I mean, I can't claim a friendship with Charlie Munger, and he certainly can. And he's learned an enormous amount from that. I just feel lucky that I get some of the tidbits secondhand, if you like. And Charlie Munger's not the only one. He has friendships with other significant economic actors who. And then another quality that this is not something I've learned from Mohnish. If I could, I just don't know how to learn it from him. I developed this terrible, something to do with, I believe, maybe it's innate to my personality, maybe it's got to do with being in the UK for a certain period of my life, where I kind of, after the social interaction, I realized that I've kowtowed to somebody in a position of power, wealth, authority. And I hate it. I wish I didn't do it, but I do it inadvertently. I don't even notice that I'm doing it only afterwards when I analyze my actions. Both my wife, Laurie, and Mohnish have this quality that it does not matter who they're talking to. They are the same, and they don't modify what they're saying or how they're saying it just because of the status of the person that they're talking to. And that's something very attractive for powerful people, because powerful people, one of the most important things they want to know is that they're getting a clear image. They don't want to be surrounded. Most intelligently powerful people don't want to be surrounded by yes men. They don't want to be surrounded by people whose view changes depending on who they're with and who they want to please. And so Mohnish has no problem. The general term would be speaking truth to power, if you like. He just does that naturally without thinking. That's who he is. And I just wish I could take that on and become that instantly. I don't know how to do that.
I completely agree with your thoughts on Mohnish. So I think the kind of work that he's done, not just on the investing front, sharing his ideas and lessons over the years, but especially on Dakshina, right? That has really changed lives of thousands of youngsters in India. In my interaction with him a few months back, in fact, he talked about the situation where he was asked for to pass on some projects for Dakshina in India. He was asked for bribes, right? And he refused, completely refused. That is not the way Dakshina works, right? Come what may, we are not going to bribe our way out to do the kind of work that we plan to do. And he actually got his way. So I think hats off to the kind of work that he's doing, and feel so lucky to be talking to you, who's such a close friend of Mohnish.
That unwillingness to engage in corruption or to participate in corruption is an example of, so it's clarity of thought, it's a moral stance, it's also a lack of fear. He'd rather fail in Dakshana than pay a bribe. But also, there's no personal vindictiveness. He doesn't get bent out of shape. He doesn't invest an enormous amount of time and energy going around in circles over this. He's figured out a very simple, we don't pay bribes. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Goodbye. End of story. And so that it's not just the unwillingness to pay the bribe, it's everything around it that is also goes into the package. I could go on and on. There are very few people who at once are quick with numbers and understand that numbers, and at the same time can quote poetry from traditional Indian poetry. And so a capacity both with words and with numbers is kind of something that's really, really fun to be around. And I don't remember the name of the poem, but we traveling in India, we'll get into a situation where we show up for a meeting and for some reason the guy's either blown us off or there's been a misunderstanding and it was actually for the next day or something. And he'll kind of pull out a piece of poetry that perfectly describes our situation, which kind of makes fun of it. And I can remember asking him, like, did you memorize that recently? And he's like, no. And I said, well, where did that come from? He doesn't even remember himself. So he's got a mind like a sponge that has absorbed things from so many different places. Really, really remarkable, quite remarkable mind. And look, there's an element of this which is just unfair. I mean, if you have a very high IQ, you have a very high IQ. That's it. I mean, like I said, Vishal, give me the extra 40 or 50 IQ points, and there'll be no stopping me. So, but I don't have those extra IQ points, so I'll have to make do with what I got.
Thank you for your insights. Like I said, I have so many investing questions, investment process related questions, which I still want to ask you. But you've been generous enough to spend almost like more than 2 hours sharing ideas that are much beyond investing. Probably for me, I think better ideas than investing. So I look forward to the second part of the series, and this is the first time that I'm going to do a second part. I'm so much look forward to the second part of this.
Yeah, with great pleasure. I look forward to that as well, Vishal. And thank you for inviting me on your show. I'm wishing you and the listeners and viewers much success as a result of it. You're doing good in the world.
Thank you so much, Guy. Thank you so much. I'm just following the North Star, as you said.
So,
thanks, Guy.